Hi, it's Katrina. My friend David is going to be helping me out with the voiceover today, so I hope you enjoy.
Number 10. Stalin versus Trotsky. When Vladimir Lenin died in 1924, the fate of the Soviet Union was left to two men, Joseph Stalin and Leon Trotsky. Even though Trotsky was far more popular, Joseph Stalin used brutality and power to win control over Russia. Trotsky, on the other hand, was eventually pushed out of the country and forced to flee to Mexico, and while there he was assassinated by one of Stalin's agents. Right before Lenin died, he condemned Stalin as a maniac. So how did Stalin manage to overcome his biggest rival to be the man in charge moving into World War II? Leon Trotsky had been good friends at one point with Vladimir Lenin. They worked together on communist ideologies, but those ideologies eventually diverged. Lenin led the radical group the Bolsheviks, while Trotsky led the much more liberal Mensheviks. But then when the revolution came in 1917, Trotsky and Lenin worked together to get the Bolshevik Party into power. When civil war was on the horizon, Trotsky established his own Red Army and fought for victory against the establishment. And his part in the revolution made him the obvious candidate for succession upon Lenin's death. But then there was Stalin, the general secretary of the Communist Party under Lenin. During his years working for the government, Stalin was busy making his own alliances. He was working in the background, hidden behind administrative duties, while Trotsky fought on the front lines. But all the bureaucracy helped Stalin in the end because he'd gained internal power within the Communist Party. When Lenin died and these two men were pitted against each other, Stalin had the political means to squash Trotsky. He was expelled from the Soviet Union in 1937 after losing most of his former influence. While in Mexico, Trotsky tried to organize a new communist group, but was bludgeoned to death with an ice axe in 1940. It's interesting to think now what might have happened if Trotsky had become the leader of the Soviet Union like he was supposed to. World War II may have turned out very differently. And now for number 9. But first I wanted to give a big shout out to Dantech Computer Services and Justin Dawn Hirschberger. Thanks so much for watching and supporting OE. If you're new here, be sure to subscribe and join the family. Number 9. Hitler versus Mussolini. In World War II, Nazi Germany's greatest military ally in Europe was Italy. In 1925, Benito Mussolini came into power as the leader of Italy's fascist regime. In a way, Italian fascism was older and more widespread than Nazism in Germany. And in 1922, Mussolini led a march on Rome with thousands of fascists in attendance. This was ultimately what led to Mussolini being appointed prime minister. It was also what caught Hitler's attention in the 1920s and gave the two leaders an early friendship. But even though the ideological similarities were there, the relationship between Germany and Italy was tenuous at best. In the late 1930s, when World War II broke out, Germany and Italy were military allies who had their own specific priorities. Their union was more a thing of convenience, and who knows what might have happened if the fascists won the war. In all likelihood, Germany would have gone to war against Italy simply to get them out of the picture. Although history paints Hitler and Mussolini as comrades, the truth is that they despised each other. Mussolini hated Hitler, describing his manifesto Mein Kampf as boring. Mussolini said Hitler was a simple man, which was a major insult. And in 1934, when they first met in person in Venice, Mussolini refused to use a translator out of stubborn pride. When they left the Venice summit, they still didn't like each other, but their radical views joined them together. Hitler was obsessed with Aryan supremacy, and he wanted to control all of Europe. And while Mussolini didn't agree with the anti-Semitism of the Nazi Party, he too wanted to control Europe. He wanted to bring back the days of the Roman Empire, with Italy in control of the continent. It was a weird situation because the leaders didn't like each other but needed one another's support as they each started their own war. Italy invaded Abyssinia, what we call Ethiopia today, and Hitler supported the move. But Italy didn't join World War II on the European stage until 1940, when the Germans had nearly conquered Europe already. When Germany invaded Poland, Mussolini refused to supply aid. All Mussolini really wanted was to control northern Africa, like the Romans had 2,000 years ago. So he began a campaign of terror in North Africa against British and French colonies. But by 1941, most of the Italian troops had been defeated. Then in 1943, the Allies invaded Italy and Mussolini was executed and hung on meat hooks. Number 8. Chiang Kaishek and Imperial Japan. World War II was so much more than just the Nazis in Europe and the Japanese attacking Pearl Harbor. In fact, one of the biggest players in the war was Chiang Kaishek, the leader of the National Revolutionary Army in China. He came into political power in 1928 with unwavering military leadership. Chiang Kai-shek embraced warlords, imperialists, criminal gangs, and forged an authoritarian dictatorship. Kai-shek campaigned on the 3 principles of the people and started out as what some would call Republican in nature. But once he had power, he abandoned the principles of the people and his government became corrupt and ineffectual. Most of the regime was dominated by rich and powerful families. It was an elitist administration that failed to solve any problems with the 500 million impoverished peasants living in China at the time. It was all about the rich, with the middle class being left in the dirt. Then 2 things happened. Japan's military presence began to accumulate in the northeast, and at the same time the Chinese Communist Party, ruled by Mao Zedong, was growing in power. Japan was the biggest power in Asia by a mile, and Zedong was achieving great success in mobilizing the hungry peasants in his country. But those in charge of the military began to ask themselves a very important question. They wondered if it would be better to wait to flex their military might over China, or if immediate military action would be a smarter decision. Tokyo was already busy pillaging minerals and agricultural resources in Manchuria, and in 1928, Japan assassinated the Manchurian warlord Zhang Zuolin with a bomb on a railroad car. The bombing led to full-blown war. Chiang Kai-shek was one of the most important allies in the war against Japan. He met with Prime Minister Winston Churchill in 1943, and he was even close allies with President Roosevelt. After World War II, Kai-shek likely would have been a major cooperative partner with the US. But civil war broke out with the Chinese Communist Party, and Kai-shek lost control over the country in 1949. Number 7. Josip Broz Tito. Even Joseph Stalin was afraid of Josip Broz Tito. He was the leader of Yugoslavia during World War II, and all these years later, he's still a highly controversial figure. Some say he was a benevolent dictator who established a socialist empire while Europe was divided. But others think he was an oppressive authoritarian. No matter what you might think though, Josip Broz Tito was still the only foreign president who smoked a cigar in the Oval Office. Josip's story begins in Croatia in 1892. He was born into a peasant family when the Austro-Hungarian Empire still existed, ruled by the inbred Habsburg family. The beginning of the 20th century saw the ancient royal family discarded, and then World War I changed Europe forever. Yosef, a boring metal worker, was drafted into the army, and in 1917 he participated in the demonstrations in St. Petersburg that helped Vladimir Lenin rise to power. In the years to come, Yosef used the same ideologies as Lenin to become the leader of his own country. In 1941, Yugoslavia was divided and occupied by Axis powers. Yosef became the leader of the resistance movement, and his goal was to liberate the lands of Yugoslavia from the occupying forces. In November 1945, Yosef created the Federal People's Republic of Yugoslavia by proclaiming a new constitution. There were 6 federated states which are now their own individual countries: Croatia, Serbia, Slovenia, Montenegro, Macedonia, Bosnia, and Herzegovina. In the beginning, Stalin thought Yosef was his comrade, but then Yosef began saying no to him, and that was when the Soviet Union realized Yosef had no intention of being Russia's puppet. Yugoslavia remained a communist state, but not one controlled by Stalin. Yosef had complete and total power over the army and the secret police, and was likely the most feared man of his time. He was once quoted as telling Stalin, "Stop sending people to kill me. We've already captured 5 of them. If you don't stop sending killers, I'll send one to Moscow, and I won't have to send a second." Number 6. Andrei Vlassov. There was a general from the Soviet Union who became one of the biggest thorns in the side of Joseph Stalin, and his name was Andrei Vlassov. He fought in the Battle of Moscow and at the Siege of Leningrad, but he was ultimately captured by Nazi troops. Being a general and a man with some power behind his name, it didn't take too much time for him to defect. He then became a member of the Third Reich, claiming he supported Nazi propaganda. Andrei didn't just talk about it, though. He did something. He went on to establish the Russian Liberation Committee and later the Russian Liberation Army as well. The Russian Liberation Army attracted hundreds of officers and thousands of troops, all of whom had defected from the misery of the USSR. But since they were already Soviets, they had an easier time operating in Soviet territory. They became a kind of ghost army, operating in Soviet territory on behalf of the Nazis. But the treachery only lasted so long for Andrei Vlassov. He was arrested by Soviet troops in Czechoslovakia as he tried to escape back to German territory following the Prague uprising. And as you can imagine, Stalin wasn't too happy about the betrayal. In the end, Andrei was tried for treason and was tortured. Then on August 1st, 1946, he was hanged. Number 5. Pope Pius XII. Pope Pius XII had the misfortune of ruling Vatican City at the outbreak of World War II. For many years, his silence during wartime has been interpreted as a potential support of the Holocaust. Throughout the war, Pope Pius never once publicly condemned what the Nazis were doing, and some people even think that he had secret knowledge of Nazi concentration camps. In 1999, British journalist John Cornwell claimed Pius believed the Vatican was superior to the plight of European Jews. The journalist went so far as to say that Pius became Hitler's personal pope and pawn. The Catholic Church, which has been a feared organization since it started, was the one who was truly afraid when World War II broke out. Pope Pius was afraid of what the Germans might do to the Catholic Church if they were victorious in Europe. The Church was also terrified of what might happen to them if communism spread across the continent. Historians say Pope Pius wasn't necessarily a Nazi supporter, but merely a man who didn't want to see the Vatican burned to the ground. The truth is hidden somewhere in the Vatican archives. Somewhere in the secret vault beneath the Vatican are documents that detail all the activities of Pope Pius during the war. But the thing about documents in the secret archives is that nobody is allowed to look at them. Yet for some bizarre reason, the Vatican recently made documents available to historians that paint Pope Pius in an atrocious light. The documents revealed by the Vatican show that Pius learned about the systematic genocide of Jews in late 1942. The documents also indicate that when the ruler of the Vatican spoke with the United States government, he refused to confirm any humanitarian crimes committed by the Nazis. But by far one of the worst things that Pius did was sign an agreement between Germany and the Vatican in 1933. This set into motion an official neutrality between the two powers. Adolf Hitler saw the agreement as approval of the Nazi regime. One could say that by agreeing to be friendly to the Nazis in the early 1930s, the Vatican gave Hitler unspoken permission to launch the Holocaust. Do you think the Holocaust still would have happened without the support of the Vatican? Tell us your thoughts in the comments down below. And while you're at it, subscribe. Number 4. Enemies within. Adolf Hitler had enemies everywhere he looked, including within his own inner circle. The Pope may not have wanted to mess with Hitler, but his top military officials didn't mind. In 1944, a group of civilian and military personnel nearly assassinated Hitler on July 20th. It was an epic failure, but it nearly ended the war. The key conspirators in the plot to murder Hitler included citizens like Karl Friedrich Goerdeler, who'd been the mayor of Leipzig in the 1930s. He left his position to oppose the Nazi leadership. Former General Ludwig Beck, who resigned when he learned of Hitler's war plans in 1938, also joined the movement. Major General Henning von Treschkow, Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg, General Friedrich Albrecht, and Klaus Heinrich Stülpnagel also opposed Hitler's aggressive agenda. However, the motives for these men to risk their lives in pursuit of an end to the war weren't necessarily the same. Of course, some were horrified by what Hitler was doing to the Jewish community, but historians think most were motivated by a strong desire to rescue Germany from catastrophic destruction. Hitler was becoming increasingly irrational. He should never have gone to war against the Soviet Union, and in 1944 it was blatantly obvious that Germany was on the brink of annihilation. Some call the conspirators heroes, but others call them war criminals. For example, Klaus Heinrich Stülpnagel was implicated in war crimes and the Holocaust. He was involved in the mass murder of Jews during his command of the 17th Army in the USSR. So in reality, these men weren't heroes at all. They were just men who didn't want to lose their jobs as their boss flushed their company down the toilet. Operation Valkyrie was the name of the assassination plot. The plan was for Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg to travel to Hitler's headquarters in East Prussia. And once he arrived, he'd place a briefcase with 2 bombs underneath the Führer's briefing table. The bomb would go off, and Hitler would burst into a million pieces. But then came the official Operation Valkyrie. It involved completely disarming the SS, taking back control of German cities, and arresting Nazi leaders. On July 20th, 1944, somebody moved a briefcase with the bomb in it, and the explosive blew up too far away to kill Hitler. The conspirators then began to coordinate the operation under the assumption that Hitler was dead, but he was still alive, and 4,980 people were executed as traitors in the following days and weeks. Number 3. King Victor Emmanuel III. Most royal families were in rapid decline at the beginning of World War II. There were still kings and queens, as well as the nobility, but the monarchies of the world were losing most of their power. One of the only monarchs who played any important role in the war was King Victor Emmanuel III of Italy. King George VI of England didn't do much except provide moral support, and King Leopold III of Belgium surrendered to the Germans against the advice of the Belgian government. King Haakon VII of Norway, however, was the complete opposite and refused to surrender to the Germans. He went into exile in the UK and established a Norwegian resistance movement. So King Haakon was definitely a major player, but for the most part kings and queens maintained neutrality, or they gave up out of fear that they'd be murdered. Even in Japan, Emperor Hirohito didn't have much control over what the generals in Japan's armies were doing. Victor Emmanuel III ruled over the Kingdom of Italy starting on July 29, 1900. But it was a terrible time to be king. When he first started, there was violence and political instability, and his lack of action resulted in Benito Mussolini and the rise of fascism. But Victor did fight back eventually. He despised Mussolini, especially since the Italian dictator managed to abolish the monarchy in Italy. When Mussolini first started his conquests, the king likely saw it as a good thing. And after Mussolini invaded Ethiopia and Albania, Victor was quick to name himself Emperor of Ethiopia and King of the Albanians. He had no problem taking on titles, but when Mussolini tried to follow Germany into war in 1939, the king prevented it. It was the king's idea to wait to see which side would come out on top. But in June of 1940, the king finally gave Mussolini permission to go to war with Europe. In all honesty, it was a disaster from the beginning. Mussolini was a poor commander, and the Italian armies were decimated, and the King of Italy quickly realized that he'd made a horrible mistake. On July 25, 1943, the Grand Council of Fascism voted to return all constitutional powers to the monarch. The king then had Mussolini arrested and immediately started negotiations with the Allies. Number 2. The American Mutiny after VJ Day. Within months of the victory over Japan and the end of World War II, American troops were already mutinying. In late August 1945, the war was finished, but there were still 7.6 million troops overseas, give or take. It had taken 4 years to get the soldiers into the field, but now the US needed to get them all home. And 5 months after Victory Day, soldiers erupted in a way that would have been unthinkable just half a year earlier. The soldiers didn't realize how much work was going on behind closed doors. Demobilization had started 8 months before Germany surrendered. The US War Department was already figuring out how to get troops back home based on a point system. And those who'd spent the most time in combat were going home first. But the whole thing was still a logistical nightmare. The rallying cry across the country was, "Bring the boys back home." There were groups that formed to reprimand the government for their slow demobilization. But the government was already working on it. And within the 5 months after Victory Day, 3 million soldiers had already returned home. But that didn't stop the mutiny of Christmas Day in 1945. A transport ship anchored in Manila was cancelled, prompting 4,000 men to march on military headquarters. The army had gone from patriotic winners to standing outside military HQ shouting at their commanders. They even had banners comparing General Robert L. Patterson to Japanese war criminal Tomoyuki Yamashita. The mutiny went on for multiple weeks. US soldiers marched in France, chanting that they wanted to go home. They also marched in London, Frankfurt, Manila, and Tokyo, and it seemed as though the soldiers were angry everywhere. And the fact that this happened really goes to show how quickly things can change once the war is over. Number 1. Japan versus the Soviet Union. Joseph Stalin had enemies inside his own government, and Adolf Hitler was his nemesis. He also hated the West with a burning passion. But one of Stalin's biggest threats in World War II was Japan. In 1939, the USSR and Japan went to war over the summer. Soviet and Japanese armies fought on the border of Mongolia and Manchuria. It involved over 100,000 troops and roughly 1,000 tanks and aircraft, and as a result, 50,000 men were either killed or wounded in the fighting. Although the Japanese were sufficiently crushed, it was merely a fistfight compared to the war to come. In the days after the fighting stopped, Hitler invaded Poland, and World War II began. The battle was between Georgy Zhukov and Suji Masanobu. Zhukov, who would go on to lead the Red Army to victory against Germany, led the Soviet forces. But this was the first battle of the war, and Zhukov really showed what he was capable of, killing 75% of the Japanese ground forces in combat. It was a humiliating defeat for Japan, and it was made even more humiliating by the fact that Hitler, who'd been a tentative ally of Japan, signed a treaty with the Soviet Union. Then, as the war developed, Japan focused elsewhere. In 1941, when Germany invaded Russia, Hitler reached out to Japan. He urged them to invade the Soviets from the Far East. If this would have happened, Russia would have likely collapsed. With the Germans coming from the west and the unstoppable might of Japan coming from the east, they would have been squashed in the middle. But Japan had run out of oil reserves and needed to take the Dutch East Indies just to keep their war machine going. They couldn't invade Russia, and so the USSR was able to use all of its power to fight back against Germany. How different do you think things could have turned out if just one important player in the war never existed? Let us know in the comments down below. And if you liked this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one. Bye.